there's still a lot of people. I think once I start, they'll come. And then... Okay, hi everyone. We're going to start our final contributed talk session. So we have 4 more amazing talks. The first one is predictive coding, dynamics, improve noise robustness in a deep neural network of the human auditory system. It will be given by Kaushik. The second one, accurate implementations of computational neuroscience models through neural ODES, will be given by Sabine and Muzellec. The third one, beyond task optimized neural network models, constraints from embodied cognition, Kaushik, Lakshminarasimhan. And the final one, lateral inhibition facilitates sequential learning in a hippocampal-inspired AUTO-ASSOCIATOR by Benjamin Midler. So please join me in welcoming Kaushik.
All right. Hi, my name is Kaushik, and today I'm going to be talking about a work in progress joint with Qing Feng, Justin Buck, advised by Guillermo Orga, exploring predictive dynamics in a deep neural network model of the human auditory system. So in everyday hearing, sounds of interest rarely occur in isolation. Say you walk into a busy coffee shop, and the barista asks you what you would like to order. The waveform entering your ear is not only the speech signal, but is also likely corrupted by noise. And this noise is linearly summed along with the barista's speech, and this is the waveform that enters your ear. To recognize sounds of interest, your auditory system must somehow become robust to background noise. A long-standing question in the field of auditory neuroscience is how does the auditory system solve this problem? There's converging evidence that auditory cortex becomes robust to background noise, and that this robustness increases across the cortical hierarchy. But the mechanism of this robustness change is unclear, although there are some insights that we can take from the auditory and visual neuroscience literature. First, there is substantial evidence that the integration of top-down predictions plays a role in audition, and that they can aid in speech processing in noisy situations. So here we see that informative prior knowledge, the black bars, improves word recognition performance. Furthermore, this work demonstrated that fMRI responses in the auditory cortex are sensitive to this prior information, with reduced activity seen when observers have informative prior knowledge, still the black bars, suggesting that predictions alter auditory processing. There's also evidence of substantial recurrent feedback connections in the primate auditory hierarchy, which are often not considered in state-of-the-art computational models. One hypothesized roles of these feedback connections is to signal top-down predictions throughout the hierarchy. Finally, we can look to vision, where computational investigations into noise robustness have matured more quickly. Here, authors took a feed-forward deep neural network, trained an object recognition task, and augmented it with predictive dynamics, and found that these dynamics made the network more robust to noise. So here, we hypothesized that predictive dynamics could improve noise robustness in the auditory hierarchy, and we're going to test this hypothesis using computational modeling. Specifically, we're going to introduce predictive dynamics into an auditory model using a framework called PREDICTIVE. PREDICTIVE was first introduced by Chomsky and Mozaffari et al., and was used to explore predictive dynamics in the visual domain. PREDICTIVE takes an existing feed-forward neural network and introduces feedback, seen here in green, that is trained on clean input to reconstruct lower-level activity from higher-level activity. After the feedback weights are learned, predictive dynamics are then introduced. The output of a layer at a given time step is the sum of 4 terms. A feed-forward term contributes feed-forward drive into the activity. A feedback term contributes predictions of lower-level activity from higher-level activity. And an error correction term corrects activity each layer to be better at predicting the activity of the previous layer. And finally, a memory term is some proportion of the activity from the previous time step, and this term allows the network to integrate activity over time steps and can be thought of as a time constant. The dynamics equations can be formalized under these variables. and hyperparameters control the proportional strength of each of these terms. A nice feature of this model is that various settings of the hyperparameters can allow the network to capture different types of predictive feedback. For instance, for those of you familiar with it, the Rao and Ballard predictive coding model is captured by setting the feed-forward drive to 0. So this is the high-level structure of the predictive dynamics in the network. We don't have time to fully dive into the equations, but I recommend checking out the original PREDICTIVE paper by Chomsky and Mozaffari et al. For an in-depth explanation of how these dynamics are working. So now we'll turn to how we trained our auditory model. The training process occurs in stages. As I mentioned before, the PREDIFY adds feedback connections to an existing feed-forward neural network. In our case, we chose to use a feed-forward network similar to the one introduced in Kell et al. In 2018. The input to the network was cochleograms, which are time-frequency decompositions of a waveform. And the network was trained to recognize sounds embedded in varying degrees of background noise, a task both the network and humans found challenging. We chose to add predictive dynamics to this network because it showed behavioral similarity to humans across a wide range of background types and SNRs. So here's the performance for humans for different background types and levels of background noise. SNR is on the x-axis and accuracy is on the y. Each line represents a different type of background noise. Unsurprisingly, these lines are sloping up and to the right. As SNR increases, performance increases. And here you can see the network performance. Note that the network performs at least as well as humans, with similar patterns of errors across conditions. For example, both humans and the network find recognizing speech embedded in 8-speaker babble the most challenging. This network also better predicted brain responses than previous models of human auditory cortex, and it gave evidence of a hierarchical structure with intermediate layers, here shown in pink, better predicting primary auditory cortex, outlined in black, and later layers shown in blue, non-primary areas. So we now have our feed-forward model. Next, we froze the feed-forward weights and trade feedback connections with a reconstruction loss on clean speech. Finally, we froze the reconstruction weights and optimized the hyperparameters to maximize recognition performance. So after completing these steps, we have our complete model. I will now dive into our results. First, to evaluate the model, we're going to ask how predictive dynamics affect task performance. If the predictive dynamics are in fact denoising, we might expect task performance to increase. And I'd like to note that of all of the following analyses, we'll be evaluating the network on a held-out speech data set. So we analyzed network performance on 3 types of background noise: pink noise, auditory scenes, and 8-speaker babble. As you look across the different types of background noise, note that the noise structures are different. Empirically, human listeners find identifying speech embedded in 8-speaker babble more challenging than the other noise types. And note that something interesting in exploring these dynamics in the auditory domain is that audition naturally lends itself to noise with complex structure, like that seen in auditory scenes and speech babble. Therefore, in the auditory domain, you can explore predictive dynamics with complex naturalistic noise, which may be more challenging to do in the visual domain. So we also varied the signal-to-noise ratio from 3 dB to -9 dB. So here I'll show word recognition performance. On the x-axis, we have SNR, and on the y-axis, we have the proportional change for the feed-forward average. For each SNR, I'll plot the results across 4 time steps of predictive dynamics. And one thing to keep in mind is the feed-forward network is already performing at high levels on this task. So here's the result for -9 dB after the first time step, second, third, and fourth. We see that for -9 dB, the performance is increasing up to time step 3, and we can now ask, what about the other SNRs? So here are the results for -6 dB. We see a decrease in overall performance. The improvement is seen across time steps. And here are the results for the other SNRs. Note that we see the largest change for the lowest SNR, -9 dB, and the smallest change for 3 dB. This suggests that the predictive dynamics are most useful for noisier sounds. Next, instead of averaging across background type, I will show the results averaging across SNR. So here are the results for speech babble. Again, each bar represents a different time step. Auditory scenes, and finally, pink noise. We see that for 8-speaker babble and pink noise, the performance increases across time steps. For auditory scenes, we see a net increase at time step 1, but no further change across time steps. So to summarize our results, so far we see that for higher SNRs, the predictive dynamics increase performance across time steps, and then for 8-speaker babble and pink noise, the predictive dynamics are improving accuracy across time steps. So now we want to investigate where this performance difference is coming from by asking whether network representations are being denoised. So we're going to present clean and noisy speech to the network, and for each layer, correlate the vector of unit responses for the two types of speech. Evidence of potential denoising would be if the correlation between noisy and clean representations increased, either across layers or time steps. So we'll begin by looking at changes in correlation across layers of the feed-forward network. So on the x-axis, I will plot the layers, and on y, the normalized correlation. So we see an increase in correlation in later layers of the network, which correspond to non-primary auditory cortex. And this is consistent with findings in the auditory literature, where later in the hierarchy, higher robustness to noise is seen. Now, instead of looking across layers, we'll ask whether predictive dynamics further denoise representations across time steps. So here on the x-axis is time step, and on the y, normalized correlation. And note that we're going to subtract off the 0th time step corresponding to the feed-forward response. So here are the results for the first layer of the network. We don't see a significant change across time steps. And here for the second, we see an increase for time step 1, but not later time steps. And here are the results for the other layers of the network. We see that for later layers, there's an increase in correlation across time steps. Now we'll look at the correlation across the different SNRs. Here are the results for 3 dB, the least noisy condition. We see an increase in correlation from time step 1 to time step 4. And here are the results for negative 9 dB. We again see increasing correlation across time steps. Together, these results are suggesting that the representation of noisy speech is becoming more similar to the representation of clean speech across time steps. So another signature of these predictive dynamics could be seen in alterations in dimensionality. To measure how dimensionality changes, we're going to use a standard method. We're going to pass in noisy speech and take the activations of a given layer and compute the cumulative singular value spectrum of these activations. We'll then summarize the dimensionality by computing the area under the curve. So here we'll plot the results across layers of the feed-forward network. Note that on the y-axis, larger values are lower dimensional and smaller values are higher dimensional. We see that as we go deeper in the network, dimensionality becomes higher, and this is consistent with the idea that higher dimensional representations aids classification performance. We can now look at changes in the dimensionality across time steps. So here I'll plot time step on the x-axis, and each line will represent a different SNR. So here's the result for 3 dB, the least noisy condition. We see that across time steps, the dimensionality decreases. And here are the results for negative 9 dB, the noisiest condition. We see again that the representations become lower dimensional across time steps, but to a greater extent than for 3 dB. And the fact that we see the most dramatic change for the noisiest condition is broadly consistent with our findings that these dynamics are most useful in classification when the task is difficult. And one thing to note is that the difference in dimensionality across layers are an order of magnitude larger than the difference seen across time steps. And this could be consistent with an account where layers separate representations of words, and predictive dynamics push representations toward a common clean manifold. So far, we've only considered the model's robustness in the speech domain. We wanted to see if our model would generalize and predict results seen outside of speech. So in the paper that introduced the feed-forward model of auditory cortex that we're using, robustness to noise was also investigated. The authors measured the statistics of a large set of natural sounds, and they split the sounds into those that had more stationary statistics and those which had less stationary statistics. So in everyday life, we would often consider sounds with more stationary statistics to be backgrounds, and those with less stationary statistics to be foregrounds. These two sound sets were presented to human listeners, and brain responses were measured using fMRI. The ratio of response of the less stationary sound to more stationary sound was computed, and it was found that in primary auditory cortex, here outlined in black, responses to the two sound sets were similar, whereas in non-primary areas, the response ratio was higher. One interpretation of this result is that the brain is becoming more robust to background in non-primary areas. We presented a similar set of stationary and non-stationary sounds to our model, and here on the x-axis, I will show layer, and on the y, the median of the response ratio across all units. So consistent with the findings in the Kell paper, we see that for early and intermediate layers of the feed-forward network, we see a more similar response to the two sound sets, whereas for later layers, which are thought to better align with non-primary areas, we saw a larger response ratio. We can then measure the same thing for the network with predictive dynamics. We see that particularly deeper in the network, the predictive dynamics increase the difference of response to less stationary and more stationary sounds. And this is a nice demonstration of the predictive network capturing results from brain data on a type of data set that's different from what it's been task trained on. So to conclude, in this ongoing work, we added predictive dynamics to a deep network model of the auditory system, and we found these dynamics improved accuracy on a challenging word classification task. And we found preliminary evidence that these dynamics operate by denoising network representations and altering dimensionality across time steps. And this network could serve as a testbed for hypotheses regarding the dynamics of auditory representations. For example, we can test hypotheses about how auditory representations change with time in response to single sounds, something not currently possible with most large-scale models of the auditory system. We can also test hypotheses about how auditory representations change in response to series of sounds, and how experience impacts auditory dynamics and perception. And finally, there may be cases where an observer would not want to use predictive dynamics, and others where a feed-forward pass is sufficient. In future work, we are interested in developing a network that can adaptively modulate its use of predictive dynamics, and this can help increase task performance and provide more connections to adaptive behavior seen in humans. So I'd like to acknowledge my excellent collaborators, Qing Feng and Justin Buck, and our advisor on this project, Guillermo Orga. And I'd also like to give a special thanks to the Van Ruin Lab, and especially Bob Anchowski and Milad Mozaffari for making Predify open source. We're very excited about future directions that we can take this model, and I'd love to chat more with anyone interested. And thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Erica. We have time for a few questions.
Hi, this model is really interesting. I was wondering if you had anything to say about the effect that you saw where there was with the pink noise and the speaker babble, but not the auditory scenes.
So I think one thing is with the auditory scenes, they're going to be more variable than the 8-speaker babble and the pink noise. It wasn't how we expected that to come out, and so I'd like to dive more into it. I also believe, and I would, that the original feed-forward network was not trained on 8-speaker babble or pink noise, whereas it was trained on auditory scenes. So that could potentially be also playing a difference.
I see, that makes sense, thank you.
I have one more question, which is, do you think, or are you planning to compare the network to the brain data from Kellenol?
So I think one issue is here we're wanting to look at time and like activity across time. And so the data from the Kelp paper collected by Sam Norway and Higner is fMRI. And so in most cases, you're just time averaging in any comparisons to deep neural networks. So ECOG or EEG would be more ideal for testing this model.
Cool, thank you. Oh.
Thanks. Just one more question, if you don't mind. The input to the network, it was a picture. I mean, it was a spectrogram. So I'm just wondering how you think about how the dynamics of the input would interact with the predictive dynamics that are running in the network.
So this is something we're actually really excited about, because now that we have a model with temporal dynamics, you can imagine continuously feeding in sound to the network. And so you can look at like what happens across trials if you present different sounds, or like you present longer backgrounds, like do you adapt more quickly, that sort of thing. Whereas with a feed-forward deep neural network, you have no sense of time, and so you can't look across time in the same way. And so we haven't explored it, but we are really excited to.
Cool.
Thank you. Please join me in thanking Erica again, and we can welcome our next speaker, Sabine.
Okay, so hi, I'm Sabine, and I'm a graduate student at Van Rulen Lab that Erica just mentioned, and the CER Lab at Bonn University. So during this conference, and we are reaching the end, we got to know a lot of interesting works from a lot of fields related to neuroscience, And here I will be focusing on two subfields, computational science and deep learning. So in the first case, we study how neurons of our brain interact, resulting in high-level functions. In deep learning, we try to take inspiration from the brain to implement those same functions into computers. And because we try to be in the intersection of those two subfields, we try to implement those computational science models and test them on the large scale using the deep learning tools and approaches. But this conversion from one field to the other is, however, not very straightforward, because the computational science models are defined by differential equations, as you can see on the left. But the deep learning models can be described as a computational graph of discrete operations, and so the associated optimization methods can't be used with continuous implementations. So a natural solution, and if we take the equation of the right, the recurrent neural networks are defined by discrete functions. So we can easily describe the original differential equation and to have a discrete function using, for example, the LR method. And this is actually commonly used and commonly done, but we show here that this is actually not the best method. And now there are others that do this process more efficiently. So let's take two example models. So thank you, Erika, again, for mentioning predictive coding. And here we'll just use the original model from Rao and Bala, which is much simpler. And the idea of the generative model defined by one state evolving with time is to minimize the prediction error, R minus RTD, where you can see, and by updating the feedback drive RTD. And then we also have edge-grow, so we scale our method to a two-states model, so more complicated. And here X is fit for the feedback drive, H1 the recurrent circuit input, and H2 the recurrent circuit output. Basically, this model represents the classical and extra-classical receptive fields of the visual cortex. And unlike the inhibition who acts linearly on a unit's output, the excitation acts linearly on a unit's input. So this model regulates the unit's response non-linearly. Long story short, edge-grow is a model with the ability to model complex interactions between units via a horizontal connection within a single processing layer. So those two models, like most of the computational science models, are defined by differential equations, but they have been discretized to be adapted at the deep learning scale, and we can take a look at the equations. So let's start with predictive coding in simpler because we just have one state, so it's a function of only one variable. And we can see here the equations of the original Rao and Ballard paper, the equation 7, defined by two terms. The first term is the feed-forward drive, and the second is the feedback error correction. So we can rewrite those equations to have them in a previous discrete form. And now we can easily rewrite those equations to have difference between two consecutive time steps. And as a consequence, we add this last term on the other side of the equation. Now we can easily deduce the final approximation by just factorizing R. So I hope you have found this exercise easy because now we are going to do it on edge-grow. So yeah, as I mentioned, edge-grow is more complicated. So now we have two equations because we have two states. We can see X, our input, and those two equations model the evolution of H1, the inhibition, and X2, the excitation, during time. So let's start by just rewriting those equations to have them in more understandable form, and now we can easily see the evolution of H1 and the evolution of H2. We haven't modified anything in the equations, just its reformulation. To make this model more amenable to computer vision applications, those equations have been transformed. First by applying an discretization, making some assumptions to simplify a bit the model, and normalized. So here, I'll just show you the discrete approximation. We are not going to do all those operations. And so despite all those modifications, this model has outperformed non-brain inspired architectures on long-distance visual feature detection tasks. But we believe that this model could have done even better if we could model more accurately the dynamic of the model by using the continuous implementations. And so that's why we are going to use neural ODES. So it's a method that has been proposed in 2018 by Chen and colleagues, for which the core idea is that certain types of neural networks are analogous to discretized differential equations. And so using off-the-shelf differential equation solvers could help get better results. So this method allows us to create a new family of neural networks by using methods that are now very efficient and very optimized from control theory, where now the number of layers in the networks represent the number of time steps that are used to solve the equation. So this method has been proven successful, helped obtain better results in time series data, and proposed a new method to compute the gradients. So more specifically, this method proposed to represent a model as a differential equation and to solve the differential equation to train the model. So many ODE solvers have been presented, and basically solving an ODE is commonly done by integration. Multiple integration methods have been invented over the years, including the simple Euler method. Basically, the principle of this method is that we want to approximate the blue curve that you can see using a starting point, here A0, which represents the network's input, and a differential equation. From a differential equation, you can calculate the tangent line. And if we take a small step along a tangent line, we arrive at A1. And A1 will be close enough to the curve if the step is small. In terms of deep learning interpretation, this step between A0 and A1 represents a layer of an unfolded recurrent neural network. So here in this example, our RNN is simply doing two linear operations. And basically, then we reproduce those steps to obtain a polygonal curve, A2, A3, A4. And at every time steps, the weights of our RNN are modified. Remember, it's an unfolded RNN that you see here. So this step represents only the forward pass of our network, but we want to train it, right? So we are going to do the backward pass. Basically, this step consists in integrating all the operations that we have done to be able to add up all the gradients of the network's parameters. And the standard propagation algorithm does so by redoing all the operations in reverse order by propagating the gradients of the loss to all the layers. But to do so, we need to store all the historic of the operation, what we call the computational graph. And this can incur a high memory cost. So to overcome this problem, the authors proposed another method, also taken from control theory, which is called the adjoint method. The principle is, instead of storing the historic of the operations, so the computational graph, we'll just solve the same equation, but backward in time. So instead of starting from A0, we start from A4. After the first time step, we deduce the gradients by computing the difference between the approximation and the original curve. Then we again redo all those operations until this time reaching the input. After a few epochs, the gradients will be reduced. So our approximation will become closer and closer to the function we are trying to represent. So the adjoint method scales linearly with problem size, has a low memory cost because now we don't store the computational graph, and explicitly control the numerical error. So everything seemed hard to implement, very technical, but actually this is quite simple because the authors released the library on GitHub, where now we just have to use a single function which will do all the steps that I described before. So to use this function, you just have to define your model, which is the function here, which is the model we are trying to represent, and declare it as an ODE together with the parameters to solve the equation. So you have different types of solvers that you can use. So the LR type solver that I just described are called fixed solvers because the time step is fixed, and so you have to define the number of time steps that you have to perform. But what's particularly interesting in this method is we can use adaptive solvers. And the principle of these solvers is instead of doing a step size of a fixed size, we will constrain the steps to be always below an impulse tolerance error. So at every time step, we want to accumulate the error, and we constrain the solvers to adapt the trajectory, and so the time steps, the step size, and the number of time steps, to always stay below an impulse tolerance error. So from both categories, we can use different solvers, where the difference is just the order of the solver. So depending now on which type of solvers we want to use, we have to set the value of the hyperparameters. So in case of the fixed solver, we define the number of time steps, but in case of an adaptive solver, we define the tolerance that we don't want to go beyond. Okay, so we have seen that the neural ODE seem to be a method well suited for the computational science models because they are defined by differential equations. Now let's see in practice what are the advantages of this method, and I will also mention some disadvantages in the end. So in order to test our models, we will incorporate them into a classification architecture. So in the first case, the ODE module contains 3 stacked layers of predictive coding, and in the second, it contains a single edge group. Then we add some dense layers at the end, and we train both models on Cypher 10. Then we compare 4 different methods. We first use an LR solver to solve the ODE, and this method represents the discretization of the model beforehand. This is strictly equivalent. And to then test all the dynamics of the model, we use some adaptive solvers to see what happens if we try to model more accurately our models. So the first tests are performed using the adjoint method. And we also use a 4th method using an adaptive solvers, but with this time the backpropagation algorithm to see if the backward method affects the performance. So the first metric we use is simply the classification accuracy. You can see here on both plots that the blue curve representing the models solved with LR are doing way worse than all the other curves. So basically, LR method is not good if we want to train our model. We are actually underestimated our models. Then if we look at the red and the green curve, representing the two solvers of 2 different orders, we can see that there is not much difference. It's because our models are actually quite simple. But for more complicated dynamics, the order of the solver can make a difference. And then the 4th curve, representing a model trained with an adaptive solvers but with backpropagation, we can see that compared to the green curve, which is using the same solver for the forward pass, it's actually quite similar. So the backward pass doesn't affect the performance. So now, in addition to the validation accuracy, we can also observe the behavior and the robustness of our models during and after training. So here you can see the equations of predictive coding, just a reminder, and in those equations, there are 2 parameters, K1 and K2. So they are called hyperparameters, and it's known that the deep learning systems can be very sensitive to the value of the hyperparameters. Here on those plots, we can see that it's undoubtedly the case for the model trained with LR. So during training, if we choose different values for those parameters, we can say that we get 3 completely different behaviors. For some values, networks just don't train, and others will make us reach half of the accuracy that we got with the base choice. Conversely, all the models trained with an adaptive solver are doing actually as good, depending on the values of the hyperparameters. Then we can also try to change the resolution of the temporal resolution after training the model. So here what we are doing is using a model that has been trained with the configuration in the bold line. We will change by 1 or more parameter the configuration and see how our models behave. So in this table, we use a model trained with LR between 0 and 1 and 20 time step. So the accuracy is the testing accuracy, and this represents the training configuration of our model. We can start by just changing the number of time steps, either be less or more precise. And in both cases, we are using 10% of accuracy. Then we change the solver and see maybe using an adaptive solver will make us reach a better or at least as good accuracy because, yeah, it was doing great at the training time, so let's see at test time. And it's actually worse. We are dividing by 2 the testing accuracy that we got with the training configuration. Then just one parameter that seemed to affect even more this drop in the accuracy is the integration boundaries. So from this table, we can see that a model trained with LR, so discretized, doesn't stay robust at all to any change in the temporal resolution. Now let's do the same test, but on a model trained with an adaptive solver. So here our model has been trained between 0 and 1 with an adaptive solver, DOPRI5, and with a tolerance of 10 to the minus 3. So this means that at every time step, the curve was always close to the function by 10 to the minus 3. So you can see the number of time steps that have been chosen by the solver to approximate our dynamic, and the testing accuracy using the training configuration. Now, if we just reduce the tolerance, so we are trying to be more precise, the number of time steps increases because the step size decreases, and we are doing as good for predictive coding and maybe actually a bit better with HGRU. Now, similarly to a model trained with LR, the integration boundary affects a bit more the performance, but we are still better. I mean, the drop is not as big. Then, similarly to the tolerance, if we change the solver by one of higher order, the number of time steps increases because we are more precise, and the performance is better with HGRU and as good with predictive coding. Now, more interestingly, is if we want to change the solver and use a fixed solver, because we want to test the different use cases of our model, we now have more control on the dynamic because we have to set the number of time steps and the integration boundaries. And we can actually perform all the tests we want because what we see on those plots is that the models stay as good. So from this table, we can conclude that compared to a model trained with LR solver, if we just use an adaptive solver, the models reach a stable point where they stay robust to any change in temporal resolution. And it allows us to test the different properties of our models without the need to retrain them or fine-tune them for every use case that we want to try. So to conclude, we have seen that in this work, we are able to model and implement our models on computational science because they are defined by differential equations using neural ODES. This method, and specifically the adaptive solvers, allow us to model more accurately the dynamic of the model because we represent more accurately the trajectory of the model during time. And it leads us to a better performance, a less sensibility to the choice of hyperparameters, and more robustness to a change in temporal resolution at test time. So as I mentioned, this method has some disadvantages. The first one is, so we saw that the backward pass doesn't affect the performance, but it's just a trade-off between the resources you have. The backpropagation algorithm is costful in terms of memory, especially if we want to use a higher the solvers with a lot of time steps. So we can compensate by using the adjoint method, but the memory becomes time. Adjoint method takes a lot of time to be computed. And also, sometimes an ODE can become stiff, so essentially acting too erratic in a region where no progress can be done by the solver because the step size is too close to 0. And so sometimes an ODE can be very hard to train and maybe even impossible, depending on the dynamic that you are trying to model. And so this is actually a preliminary work. So there are a lot of directions to improve this work. I will just mention some of them here. So we have some biological models, but we have only evaluated them using deep learning metrics. So we could now focus on more the biological analysis. Specifically, those models were not designed for classification. HGRU is a model that were designed for segmentation. Predictive coding is a generative model. So now we could focus on their specificities to see how they behave and how better we can, how best can be the performance. Then we also know that biological models tend to be more robust to noise. We could check if this ability is at least present with neural ODEs and maybe accentuated. Also, those two models, and like most of the computational science models, are known to emerge some contextual phenomena during the different tests that we can do. Like, for example, predictive coding showed unstopping, or HGRU was responsive to tiltilation. So we can see if those models, at least with neural ODE, show the same phenomena, but maybe more interestingly looking for others. And finally, we are trying to model accurately the dynamic, so we could really take a look at the dynamic, try to see, for example, in predictive coding, how the prediction error is decreased with time, or to look at the interaction between inhibition and excitation in age group. So yeah, there are many directions that we could take. I can't mention all of them. And yeah, to conclude, I would like to thank my both supervisors, so Ruffin and Thomas, also Mathieu for introducing me to neural ODES, and all of the collaborators in both labs. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Sabine. We have time for some questions. And maybe while we're waiting, I can ask a clarification question. So when you have a static input and you had the multiple neural ODEs, but that were unrolled then into feed-forward networks, is that right?
Yeah.
Can you give some intuition as to how then that's different to an equivalently sized, more standard feed-forward network?
Well, there is actually not real an exact equivalent to a feed-forward network. Here we can compare ODEs with a recurrent neural network. And so the difference is that a recurrent network has always the same input at every time step. But neural ODEs, there is this feed-forward drive, but after one time step, we take the output and we add it somehow to the new input. And so the input is now dynamic.
They're still they're trained though via the back okay.
Okay, yeah, the training time,
Yeah.
basically the difference is in the forward pass, right?
Uh-huh.
The backward pass is still backpropagation or adjoint method. So the difference is if we have a forward pass in the RNN, the input is, for example, an image is always the same image.
Got it.
Whereas with neural ODEs, we always use the information computed at the previous time steps to update the weights.
Thank you.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, but what happens if can you apply this method to cases where there's time-varying input, like a sequence of words or something?
This is actually what have been done previously. Neural ODEs were, this method has actually been developed for time series data.
Okay, but in that case, then what is the difference between neural ODEs and a recurrent network, formally?
It's actually the model in itself which is different.
Okay.
But there are a lot of, you can check all the references. We can also chat after if you want some references. But yeah, basically it has actually, this method was developed for time series data and irregularly sampled data.
Okay, thanks.
All right, let's thank Sabine again. And welcome our next speaker, Kaushik.
Hi, everyone. So, yeah, I'm Kaushik. I work in the Center for Theoretical Neuroscience at Columbia. The work I'm about to share with you today was done in close collaboration with Akis, who is a postdoc in the Angel Aki lab at NYU. And I should also mention that Zach Pitko was closely involved in laying the foundations for this study. So the high-level question that I set out to answer is sort of somewhat aligned with the discussions we had in GAC1, which is how do we build more neural models that are more brain-like? And there was some consensus about the need to go beyond building task-optimized models by incorporating additional constraints, such as building like biophysically realistic neurons or topographical organization, et cetera. What I hope to sort of show you is that we could also get useful constraints from just looking at the behavior itself, provided we use tasks that are rich enough. So why might that be? So let's begin by reviewing what a typical task-optimized approach looks like. So first, we pick a task for the brain to solve, and then we build a model that solves the same task. And then we look at the internal representation of the model and the brain, and if the correlation is high, we're all happy. Now, this approach has been fairly successful, but we're far from having models that have perfect correlations to the brain. And I think at least part of this is due to the fact that there's a big gulf in architectural complexity between the brain and current models. So in the brain, there's this notion of distributed neural computation where brain areas that kind of perform very different functions seem to interact with each other, which is a far cry from the kind of off-the-shelf neural network models that we use, which are nonetheless good enough to solve the task. So given this, the question is, how might one go about building, sort of evolving these neural models into something that looks more brain-like in some sort of organic way? So I guess one way forward is to sort of take inspiration from this quote by a psychologist who said, "Ask not what's inside your head, but what your head is inside of." Now, I think asking not to look inside the head is a little too extreme, so I'm going to ignore that part and just focus on what's left of it. So what's basically, what is our head inside of? Well, it's inside a world full of opportunities to interact with it in a variety of ways. Opportunities that animals that perform highly controlled tasks are deprived of. So one solution could be to sort of use tasks that are more naturalistic, such that animals are able to use strategies that their brain evolved to use. And then we can build models that not only solve the same task, but also do so in a way that's very similar to animals. And the hope is that the resulting model will have representations that are better matched with the brain. So we designed one such naturalistic paradigm, which is basically a virtual reality-based spatial navigation task. And we sort of used this to test both humans and monkeys. And what you'll see is basically a video showing a series of 4 or 5 trials. And on each trial, there's a target in the form of a circular disk that appears only briefly, and the animal has to remember where this target is, and then use a joystick to steer towards it. And monkeys get rewarded for correctly stopping at the target location. So as you can see, this environment has no explicit spatial landmarks, so participants must navigate by integrating their own movements. And to keep things as natural as possible, we allow them to freely move their eyes while they perform this task, which has sort of 2 benefits. From the animal's point of view, monkeys and humans get an opportunity to interact with the world in a natural way. And from a scientific point of view, we get an opportunity to gain more information about what the animal is thinking, because eyes are a window into the cognition, as they say. So that's the task. Now let's look at the task performance. So here's one particular trial. The blue line shows the spatial trajectory seen from above. The filled circle is where the animal starts from, and the open circle is where the target is. And on this particular trial, the monkey performs reasonably well. And we can quantify, one way sort of to quantify this would be to kind of compare the location of the target against the stopping location. And if these data points are close to the unit line, then we can say that the performance is reasonably good. And that's indeed the case for almost all trials. And this is so also for human participants. So basically, both humans and monkeys can successfully perform this task. So let's look at their behavioral strategy. So like I mentioned, we allow them to freely move their eyes, and we measure their eye movements. So what's shown here is basically the horizontal and vertical component of eye movements as a function of time. Each line corresponds to one trial, and one thing that we see immediately is that there's a lot of structure to it. So, so the question is then, what is this structure? So one sort of way we can try and understand what the structure corresponds to is by thinking about what the eye movements will look like if the animal was actually looking at this at the goal location. So this can be sort of obtained by projecting the path they take onto the screen coordinates, and sure enough, the prediction is that the horizontal component should converge towards the middle of the screen, and the vertical component should go downwards, and that's kind of qualitatively similar to what we see. And now we can sort of quantify this by doing a regression of the actual eye movement traces against the prediction from, what we'd expect if they were looking at the goal. And we can confirm that there is quite a bit of influence of goal position on sort of explaining their pattern of eye movements. But remember that the goal location itself is not visible, right? Because the target is only transiently shown on the screen, so they could not possibly be tracking the true goal location because that's a latent world state. What they might instead be tracking is their internal estimate of the goal location. So we don't have a direct way to measure what they're thinking, but we do know their internal estimate at the end of the trial, which is basically where they stop, because the task is to stop when they think they've reached the goal. So we can regress their eye movements against the stopping position, and now we see an inverted pattern. So this sort of confirms that the animal seems to be tracking their believed goal location. And we see a very similar pattern of eye movements in humans, so this seems to be a generic strategy that's conserved across both species. Now, so what I've shown you is that belief about the relative goal location is embodied in eye movements, but is this actually necessary to do the task? Well, if we ask humans to perform the same task by not moving their eyes, their performance is substantially worse. So it seems like this embodiment somehow goes into supporting task performance. And now, kind of before we are able to model sort of this phenomenon, there's one question that we need to ask ourselves, which is why might embodiment be useful in this sort of task? Now, to answer this, we can try and kind of think about what kinds of computations the animal needs to perform to solve the task. Well, first, it needs to kind of infer velocity from the pattern of optic flow. And then from the estimated velocity, it needs to be integrated over time to kind of estimate position. And the position estimate can be used to guide future actions. Now, in principle, eye movements might be helping out with either of these. So there's some theoretical work that argues that looking where you go is actually helpful in parsing the pattern of optic flow to infer velocity, so that's one possibility. Alternatively, eye movements might be participating in the integration process itself, because integration is sort of a kind of a difficult computation. It needs a lot of working memory. And it's possible that the brain is sort of offloading some of the working memory burden to kind of eye movements. So that's sort of the other possibility. And kind of we want to know which of these is sort of the major reason why animals use this strategy. And we did this by kind of manipulating the format of the observations. So we do the exact same experiment in humans, but now instead of using optic flow, they need to sort of solve the same task, but by using vestibular cues. So they're seated on this motion platform, and they experience this physical sensation of movement. So the task remains the same, but there's no optic flow. And what we find is that their pattern of eye movements are surprisingly very similar. So this kind of suggests that their eye movements, at least in large part, is actually kind of helping out with the belief computation by participating in the integration process. So, all right, so we're ready to sort of model this phenomenon. So kind of we start with this generic recurrent neural network that receives a transient input that tells it where to navigate to. And yeah, this input is transient, so it goes away and the network is on its own. It has to figure out sort of an appropriate output, which in this case is taken to be the acceleration. And this acceleration profile should correspond to a spatial trajectory that gets the model to the target location. And in order to do this, the model gets the sensory feedback in terms of a noisy velocity signal. And it basically needs to integrate this velocity signal to kind of reconstruct some belief about the latent world state, and that can be used to drive the sort of motor output. And but we saw that this task objective is actually achieved by using a specific strategy, which is, oh, by the way, I should mention that in general, this integration process is thought to be performed in the posterior parietal cortex. So just for concreteness, I'm calling this a recurrent neural network, is PPC. And we saw from the behavioral data that animals tend to use a specific strategy where the beliefs are explicitly encoded in their eye movements. So to sort of incorporate that information into this model, I introduced this other module called oculomotor cortex and introduced bidirectional connections between these two areas, where there is an additional auxiliary loss to train the model, where we required that the neurons in the OC module should encode the internal belief, or sort of an estimate of where the position, where the animal's position is. And these, the weights shown in green are basically trained using standard gradient-based methods, in this case backprop through time. And we look at the task performance, and this model kind of has a very similar performance to the animals. And so we know that the model can kind of do the task. But now we can also ask what the sort of eye movements of the model look like. These are just the activations of the OC module. And because we sort of, by construction, required the OC module to track the internal estimate of position, we kind of get a good match in terms of the behavioral strategy. So what I've shown you is that we picked a task that's naturalistic. Both humans and monkeys can do this task, and this sort of a strategy-inspired model can also do the task, and they both have this sort of, they use this specific strategy where the beliefs are embodied in eye movements. But what I did not show you is that one could also have trained a generic RNN to do this task, which can get you good performance, but it, by construction, cannot explain the specific strategy used by animals. So, and the one final question that's left to answer is, do we actually gain something by building the strategy into this model? So let's look at the neural representation. So what we did was we kind of recorded from posterior parietal cortex of monkeys when they did this task. We recorded from hundreds of neurons and tried to decode the sort of most important task-relevant variable that I've been focusing on, which is the latent world state. So what's shown in gray is basically the relative position of the target, so both distance and angle, as a function of time on a subset of trials. And sure enough, we were able to decode that variable very well from a population of neurons. Now we can go a step further and try to decode that same variable, but now by retaining only a subset of principal components in the activity of posterior parietal cortex. And it kind of can be seen that most of the information is sort of in the leading principal components. So the ability to decode kind of is very high if you only retain kind of the top 5 or 6 principal components. And when we kind of do the same sort of analysis in the model we built, it's very similar. So a lot of the information about belief is encoded in the leading PCs. And this happens because this interaction between the two brain areas sort of causes the belief signals to be recurrently amplified and expressed in the leading principal components. Whereas the other model where the learning happened just sort of within posterior parietal cortex, kind of didn't have this opportunity to kind of recurrently amplify the belief signal, so they remain buried in the low variance modes. So we can see that there is sort of not only an advantage of, in terms of like building a model that qualitatively reproduces the behavioral strategy, but we can also sort of explain the neural data better. So just to conclude, to build better models of the brain, we must use naturalistic tasks because they admit rich behavioral strategies, which give us new constraints that can sort of help us build models by taking into account how the task must be solved. Thanks.
We have time for questions. Okay, I have a question, which is, that was really interesting. I'm curious about what you think the role of action or embodiment in particular is, or, I mean, in addition, when you move your eyes, you also get additional visual information, and I wonder if there's a way to passively deliver that information to people, and if there were, if you think that would be sufficient.
Yeah, you mean passively deliver that information that they would have obtained otherwise by making active movements? Yeah, so yeah, that's not something I've thought about, but yeah, it'll be interesting to compare kind of the performance for some sort of simulated pattern of kind of. So one thing that we've done though is we kind of passively replay the sort of movies that they self-generated, and we kind of don't see such a strong sort of tracking behavior in their eyes. So it seems like kind of active engagement is sort of necessary, at least to some extent.
That's awesome. That's along the lines of what I was wondering. One more small follow-up is there a lot of trial-to-trial variability within a person in, like if you, in the same task? So
yeah, I mean, this task was deliberately made in a way where there's no sort of repeated trials. So there is definitely variability, but yeah, even when I sort of analyze the data by kind of taking similar trials, like there is quite a bit of variability. But the interesting thing is that variability in behavioral performance can actually be predicted by their pattern of eye movement. So yeah, so when we can know from their sort of eye movement pattern whether a particular trial was sort of an accurate trial or kind of not so accurate.
All right, let's thank Kaushik again. And bring Benjamin up for the last talk of the session.
Oh, there we go. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. I know it's a nice day outside, so the fact that you're voluntarily in this windowless room, I appreciate it. Thank you. I'm here to talk to you about a hippocampal model, specifically one that illustrates how lateral inhibition can facilitate sequential learning. And My name is Benjamin Midler. I'm a senior studying psychology and biology at Stanford. I work in the labs of Carl Deiseroth, Shaul Druckmann, Brian Knudsen, and this work in particular was done in collaboration with Jay McClelland. With that, we can kick things off with the motivating question, which begins with an interesting bifurcation that exists between biological and artificial intelligence, specifically with respect to catastrophic interference. In particular, the brain has a well-documented ability to simultaneously retain and form memories, with an example being the ABAC memory task. In this task, subjects are instructed to learn an association between items A and B, and then subsequently told to learn a new association between the same A and a new C. And despite the fact that these two memory traces are in competition with one another, subjects prove quite capable of remembering both when tested. By contrast, artificial neural systems are susceptible to memory interference. For instance, a network trained to optimality on one task will see that memory completely eroded as it is trained on a new task. And this divergence between biological and artificial neural systems presents both a question and an opportunity. The question is whether the brain's memory systems can be used as a template to build artificial neural systems with superior memory abilities, constituting an example of how neuroscience may serve as an inspiration for artificial intelligence research. Completing the circuit, the corollary to this is whether the precipitant artificial neural networks can be used to advance neurobiological theory. Now, this is quite a general framework that is applicable in a number of different domains, but for this precise research, the motivating question is a specific one: whether the architectural properties of neurobiological memory systems, with an emphasis placed on the hippocampus, will prove sufficient for conferring resistance to catastrophic interference in artificial neural systems. With that, moving on to the foundation, the hippocampus is, as there's no need to reiterate, a very complex neural structure that is itself composed of multiple subregions with intricate wiring and circuitry. As such, I'm going to be focusing on one, the dentate gyrus, and that's primarily because the dentate is in possession of several characteristics, neural characteristics, that are relevant to this question of memory interference, namely sparsity, inhibition, and orthogonality. Orthogonality in the sense that patterns that are input to the dentate adopt an increasingly decorrelated form as represented in the dentate's neural code. Inhibition, as the dentate gyrus features a large proportion of inhibitory interneurons, and as a related point, sparsity, as a large proportion of dentate neurons, or apologies, a small proportion of dentate neurons are active at any given moment. And efforts to instantiate these three properties in modeling and theoretical accounts of the hippocampus have proven quite successful over the years, with these 6 constituting key examples. An important point is the fact that several of these examples, these 3 in particular, made use of an autoencoder architecture. The precise nature of an autoencoder is something I'll talk a bit more about in the next section, but a key feature of the autoencoder is that it forms latent representations of its input, a property the dentate is believed to share. Given that foundation in the literature, the precipitant hypothesis for this work is as such: an artificial neural system, a model of the hippocampus built with key architectural features of the dentate gyrus, such as the formation of latent representations and featuring inhibition, will produce the following neural properties as emergent characteristics, namely orthogonality, sparsity, and of particular emphasis here is resistance to memory interference, although if anyone has a question about how the first 2 are instantiated, I'm happy to address that at the end. And with that, we can move on to the model itself and the evaluative paradigm. As I mentioned, the model we're employing here is a fairly simple autoencoder whose training objective, as with all autoencoders, is for its output to recapitulate its input. Of further importance is the fact that there is a latent representation forming hidden layer here, which previous authors have likened to the dentate gyrus specifically. It's important to note that the softmax function is applied to the activity in this hidden layer as a computational analog for inhibition. Previous authors have implemented this inhibition in a number of different forms. Some, for instance, have used an explicit sparsity penalty in the loss function, but with regards to models of the hippocampus, softmax constitutes a well-validated option. And to give you an example of the effect it has, here are two example traces of hidden layer activity, both without softmax inhibition on the left and with softmax inhibition on the right. And as you can see, this inhibition produces far sparser layer activity, which is one of those key dentate abilities or characteristics that we're looking for. As for model evaluation, we subjected the model to a fairly challenging sequential learning task. In this task, we created a data set of 15 random binary patterns with sparsity set to 33%. And the model was trained on each pattern in a sequential, non-interleaved fashion, with each pattern presented 200 times and parameters updated at each presentation. Following training on each pattern, the model is evaluated in two ways that tackle both sides of the memory and learning equation. Memory is evaluated through reconstruction performance of the first learned pattern via cosine similarity, and learning is evaluated similarly through reconstruction performance of the just learned pattern, in this case p sub 1. As such, the model is evaluated both on its first memory and its most recent memory. With that, we can move on to the results. Kicking things off with the memory performance test, in addition to the model with inhibition, we tested a number of controls. For instance, in gray here, we have a random model, which is architecturally identical to the model with inhibition. However, following each pattern presentation, its parameters are updated randomly. As such, it constitutes a performance floor for this test. We next evaluated a standard autoencoder, which is absent of the inhibition. And as you can see, it evidences the kind of catastrophic interference we're hoping to avoid here, as memory performance for, again, the first learned pattern falls to within random levels with the next learned pattern, indicating it is indeed forgetting that pattern. As a positive control, we used elastic weight consolidation, or EWC. This is an algorithm for preventing catastrophic interference and serves as a benchmark for such prevention that was developed by Kirkpatrick and colleagues in 2017. And as you can see, it's performing as advertised here, as memory performance significantly exceeds the standard autoencoder throughout the task. Moving on to the model with inhibition, which is the one we're really interested in it, you can see it performs almost indistinguishably from elastic weight consolidation throughout the task, providing confirmation that the model is indeed resisting memory interference, comparably with elastic weight consolidation. Lastly, we took a look at a combination model which employed both inhibition and elastic weight consolidation, and as you can see, it significantly protected memory more than all other model versions. Memory performance, of course, is only half the story, though, with learning being the other. And as you can see here, the standard autoencoder performed at ceiling for new learning, which is indicative of overfitting to that new learning, which is what you'd expect from an autoencoder evidencing catastrophic interference. By contrast, elastic weight consolidation saw a significant decline in learning performance over the course of the task, and this is indicative of the trade-off that exists between preserving existing memories and learning new ones. The model with inhibition, however, performed almost indistinguishably from the standard autoencoder. I promise it's there, it's just very close, indicating that its learning ability is largely unimpeded by its maintenance of existing memories. The model with both inhibition and elastic weight consolidation, by contrast, saw the most severely impeded ability to learn new memories, suggests that it's overconstrained and is becoming memory saturated. So what can we take away from these results? In a nutshell, we've demonstrated that while the models with inhibition and elastic weight consolidation are similarly able to resist interference, the model with inhibition is able to do so with a smaller detriment to new learning. And the fact that these two models perform differently in and of itself raises an interesting question. And to explain what I'm on about, I'm going to return to this diagram, which illustrates how interference occurs in artificial neural systems when the model leaves the optimal location in parameter space for one task in order to occupy that of another. Back in 2017, Kirkpatrick and colleagues explained that their algorithm, elastic weight consolidation, mitigates this issue by constraining the parameter update trajectory such that the model moves to the location in parameter space that mutually satisfies both tasks. Given that the model with inhibition also mutually satisfies multiple tasks, it may be logical to think that it is incentivizing a similar parameter update trajectory. However, this has not been confirmed. To try to confirm that, we repeated the sequential learning task. However, this time, instead of evaluating learning performance and memory performance, we instead recorded the parameters of each model throughout training and then concatenated them together to constitute the high-dimensional joint parameter space of all models over training. We then apply principal components analysis to reduce this high-dimensional space into an easily visualizable 2, and then we projected the parameter update trajectories of all models into this space in order to compare them. And this is what we saw. And as you can see here, the model with inhibition incentivizes a wholly different parameter update trajectory than elastic weight consolidation, as they occupy completely different quadrants of this graph. So what does this tell us? Well, rather than being schematized as neat ovals with a very neat and single overlapping region, perhaps parameter space looks something more like this, as it's constituted by amorphous blobs with multiple overlapping regions, each with their own nuances and gradations of performance. And the models with inhibition and elastic weight consolidation perhaps incentivize unique trajectories that occupy differing spaces, again, each with their own features and properties. With that, we can move on to the conclusions. At this point, we've demonstrated that an analog for dentate inhibition conferred resistance to catastrophic interference in an autoencoder model of memory, constituting an example of how neuroscience can inspire artificial intelligence design. And completing the circuit, we've demonstrated that inhibition constrained learning in a unique fashion, providing fertile ground for future memory circuit and systems research. And as such, one of the objectives I had for this project, in addition to finding some interesting results, was to test a case study for how neuroscience and AI may exist in a synergistic relationship. With that, there are a number of people I'd like to thank for their help on this work, the members of Span Lab and Memory Lab, some of whom may be in this room, so if so, thanks again for being here. Also, Nick Haber and John Kochalka for their input on this work and this presentation, and of course, Jay McClellan for, first of all, always encouraging me to keep things simple, for stimulating discussions and debate throughout, and of course, for being such a wonderful mentor. At this point, I left a few extra minutes for questions because I'm a glutton for punishment, so if anything has come up, please don't hesitate to ask. Thank you.
Hey, thanks for the really cool talk. I'm wondering if you've compared to a standard model with memory replay, since I'm not an expert in the hippocampus, but I think the hippocampus does that too.
Yeah, so there are a number of properties of the hippocampus relevant to its memory performance. You mentioned some. Recurrence is another big one that I'm particularly interested in. And while there's a lot of work looking at the relationship between simple autoencoder models and certain recurrent memory systems and models of memory systems, that was not a dimension I explicitly chose not to address here, as I hope to keep this system as simple as possible and to really focus in on inhibition as an intervention and trying to understand the effects it has for memory performance and also for instantiating some of those other dentate characteristics I mentioned earlier, such as sparsity and orthogonality. So to your point, there are a number of hippocampal properties that are relevant to memory, and going forward, they're all things I certainly like to look at instantiating in a model to prove the generalizability of these principles.
Got it. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Rob Mock from Cambridge. Really nice talk. I was wondering, your decrease in performance from the inhibition and the AWC kind of experiments, is that related to the capacity of the DG, the kind of the layer you have? And if so, does that mean that you can't learn more stuff? Is it like a small-ish network to show the learning rules, or can it actually scale to like, more different tasks as well?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it's something I'm actively looking at, applying these principles to larger, more complex models, in particular looking at how it applies to convolutional autoencoders and so on. And thus far, I'm seeing that it does scale. There are a few different architectural decisions you have to make. For instance, softmax as an implementation of inhibition works well for smaller layers, but once you start getting into like hundreds of units, for instance, because it just becomes less and less biologically plausible as it's applied indiscriminately across the whole layer, whereas inhibition in the brain follows local trends. So there are a few options I'm looking at as to how to address that. As to your question specifically about the effects of memory as you increase layer size, so given the mechanism of elastic weight consolidation, I do suspect that in a much larger model, its performance would increase, but the architecture was consistent between inhibition and elastic weight consolidation in these tests. So whether or not inhibition would see a similar performance increase, if you increase the size of the model, it's already practically performing at ceiling. So specifically with respect to the learning test, so that's neither here nor there. One other point I will say about the size of the hidden layer that was used in this test. So the anatomical dentate gyrus is fairly large in terms of its number of neurons, and I started off using a much larger hidden layer, but because of the effects of the inhibition, increasing the size of that layer beyond the levels that were used in these tests, not only did they not impact performance of the model with inhibition, they also did not change the number of units that were active. So as such, it really would make no difference other than increasing your compute time.
So I guess it makes sense that EWC would be great for lots of tasks because that's how it works, right? But
yeah. Wouldn't
inhibition be more difficult to control because it's now and because if it's a bigger layer, if there's more inhibition.
Yeah. That's so I mentioned different implementations of inhibition a little bit ago, and that's exactly what I'm running into. So I'm trying to develop like local inhibition rules that are exerted between units, and it's difficult. So yeah, you're right on the money there.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
All right, let's thank all of our speakers one more time for the fantastic talks. We have a lunch break. We'll meet back here at 2:45 for the final GAC on what is the role of planning, place of planning.